An elderly woman begged on the street, and the millionaire froze when the boy called her Grandma. On a freezing Portland sidewalk, an elderly woman in a frayed coat silently extends a cup, invisible to the world, until a little boy stops and calls her Grandma. Just steps away, a millionaire drops his coffee, his face drained of color as a name he buried decades ago resurfaces. But who is she? And why does her gaze still haunt him? Margaret Wilson's weathered hands trembled as she extended her small paper cup toward the stream of people exiting the towering glass building in downtown Portland. The autumn wind cut through her threadbare coat, once a fine garment of deep burgundy, now faded and frayed at the edges. At 73, her body ached from sitting on the cold concrete for hours, but she had little choice. "Spare some change, please," she asked, with a voice that still carried traces of the literature professor she once was, before the hospital bills and the investment scam that had stolen her life savings 3 years ago. Most people walked past without acknowledging her existence. She had become invisible, just another elderly homeless person in a city with too many already. Margaret didn't blame them. Before her fall from middle-class security, she too had averted her eyes from those asking for help. Across the street, 8-year-old Elijah Foster clutched his mother Vanessa's hand as they left the children's bookstore. His bright blue eyes scanned the busy street, taking in the commotion of downtown until they fixed on Margaret. "Mom, can we give that lady something?" he asked, tugging toward the hunched figure. Vanessa hesitated. "I don't have cash, honey." "Come on, we're late for your appointment." But Elijah pulled free, his small hand digging into his pocket for the $5 bill his uncle had given him for his birthday the previous week. Before Vanessa could stop him, he darted across the street during a break in traffic. "Elijah, wait!" she called, rushing after him. Margaret looked up as the small boy approached, his earnest face a welcome change from the avoidance she usually encountered. "Here," he said, extending the crumpled bill. "This is for you." "Thank you, dear," Margaret replied, her eyes crinkling with genuine gratitude. "That's very kind." As their eyes met, Elijah tilted his head curiously. Something about her seemed familiar. The way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the slight tilt of her head. In that moment, a fragment of memory flickered in his mind. A lullaby, the scent of lavender, a gentle hand brushing his hair. "Grandma?" The word escaped his lips as a question, confusion evident on his face. Just then, a sleek black Bentley pulled up to the curb. The rear door opened, and Harrison Pierce, CEO of Pierce Financial Group and one of Portland's wealthiest residents, stepped out. He adjusted his tailored suit and was about to enter the building when he heard the child's voice. "Grandma, is that you?" Harrison turned, his gaze traveling from the boy to the elderly woman. The coffee cup he was holding crashed to the ground, hot liquid splashing across the sidewalk. His face drained of color as he stared at Margaret. "Marion," he whispered, using a name no one had called Margaret in decades. Vanessa finally reached her son, grabbing his hand. "I'm so sorry. He just ran off," she apologized to Margaret before turning to scold Elijah. "Honey, this isn't your grandmother. Your grandma lives in Baltimore, remember?" But Harrison Pierce couldn't move, frozen in place as decades of carefully buried memories surged to the surface. This woman, this homeless, broken woman begging on the street, was the same person whose photograph he kept locked in his desk drawer, whose name he had forbidden to be mentioned in his home for 20 years. "Marion Wilson," he said, louder this time, his voice a mix of disbelief and dawning horror. Margaret looked up at the sound of her formal name, her eyes narrowing as she studied the well-dressed man standing before her. Recognition slowly dawned, followed by a flash of something darker. Fear, perhaps. or shame? Harrison, she acknowledged quietly, clutching her cup tighter. It's been a long time. Vanessa looked between them, confusion evident on her face, while Elijah continued to stare at Margaret with a strange intensity. You know each other? Vanessa asked. Harrison Pierce didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on Margaret, the woman he'd spent 2 decades trying to forget. The woman who had once meant everything to his family before she destroyed it all. She's my mother-in-law, he finally said, his voice hollow. My dead wife's mother. The silence that followed Harrison's statement seemed to stretch endlessly. Pedestrians continued to flow around them, oblivious to the emotional earthquake taking place on that small patch of sidewalk. Your dead wife's mother, Vanessa repeated, looking at Margaret with new interest. But that would make her no one, Harrison interrupted sharply. She is no one to us anymore. Margaret's weathered face revealed little, but her knuckles whitened around her paper cup. The years had taught her to expect nothing from Harrison Pierce. Not kindness, not acknowledgement, and certainly not forgiveness. I should go, she murmured, attempting to rise from her spot against the wall. Her arthritic knees betrayed her, causing her to stumble. Elijah instinctively reached out to steady her. Be careful, ma'am. The boy's touch, gentle and without judgment, nearly broke Margaret's carefully maintained composure. How long had it been since someone had touched her with kindness rather than clinical detachment or disdain? Harrison watched the interaction with visible discomfort. His assistant emerged from the building behind him, tablet in hand. Mr. Pierce, your 10 o'clock is waiting upstairs. The acquisition paperwork needs your signature immediately. Cancel it, Harrison said, not taking his eyes off Margaret. Clear my morning. The assistant's jaw dropped slightly before professionalism reasserted itself. Yes, sir, she replied, retreating quickly. Vanessa, sensing the tension, placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder. Elijah, we should go. Your doctor's appointment. You're her, aren't you? Elijah interrupted, his eyes fixed on Margaret. You're the lady from the silver frame. Harrison's head snapped toward the boy. What frame? The one on your desk, Elijah explained. In your home office. The picture of the lady reading to the little girl under the big tree. You told me it was no one important when I asked, but you always touch it before you close your desk drawer. Color flooded Harrison's face, part anger, part embarrassment at having his private sentimentality exposed. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. You kept it? After all this time? I kept nothing, Harrison replied coldly, but the slight tremor in his voice betrayed him. A police officer approached, eyeing Margaret with the practiced look of someone about to move along an unwanted presence. Everything okay here, folks? Ma'am, you know the rules about soliciting in this area. Before Harrison could speak, Elijah stepped forward. She's my grandfather's family. We just found her. The boy's simple declaration, spoken with such certainty, landed like a physical blow to Harrison's chest. The officer looked between the expensively dressed executive and the homeless woman, clearly skeptical. Is that true, sir? Harrison opened his mouth, the denial ready on his lips, when Margaret spoke. Officer, I'm just leaving. No need to trouble yourself. She gathered her few possessions, a tattered backpack, a plastic bag containing what appeared to be everything she owned in the world, and began shuffling away. Wait, Harrison called, surprising himself as much as the others. Marion, wait! Margaret paused but didn't turn. Where are you staying? He asked. A bitter smile crossed her face. I rotate between the shelter on Burnside when there's space, and a doorway behind Powell's books when there isn't. Vanessa gasped softly at the matter-of-fact way Margaret described her precarious existence. Even Harrison, who had cultivated indifference toward his mother-in-law for decades, seemed shaken. That's unacceptable, he said finally. You're coming with me. I don't want your charity, Harrison. It's not charity, he replied tersely. It's a conversation that's 20 years overdue. Margaret finally turned to face him fully, her dignity somehow intact despite her circumstances. Why now? Because you're embarrassed to have your associates see your family begging on the street? Or because that boy has stirred something you thought was safely buried? Harrison flinched as if struck. Because Catherine would never forgive me if she knew. At the mention of that name, Margaret's composure finally cracked. A single tear traced its path down her lined cheek. Catherine is gone, she whispered. She's been gone for 20 years. Yes, Harrison agreed, his voice suddenly tired. And it's time I heard your side of what happened that night. The interior of Harrison's penthouse apartment overlooking the Willamette River couldn't have been more different from the doorways and shelters Margaret had called home for the past 18 months. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city, while minimalist furniture in shades of charcoal and ivory spoke of wealth that preferred not to announce itself too loudly. Margaret stood awkwardly in the entryway, acutely aware of her shabby appearance. The housekeeper, Nina, had barely concealed her shock when Harrison arrived with the elderly homeless woman in tow, instructing her to prepare the guest suite. "You should shower and change," Harrison said, not unkindly. "Nina will find something suitable for you to wear." "I don't need—" "Please," he interrupted, his tone softening slightly. "For practical reasons, if nothing else." Margaret nodded, following Nina down a hallway lined with abstract art pieces that probably cost more than what she had lived on for years. Left alone, Harrison poured himself a scotch, despite the early hour. His hand wasn't entirely steady. The universe had a twisted sense of humor. Today, of all days, the 20th anniversary of Catherine's death, to bring Marion Wilson back into his life. His phone vibrated with a message from Vanessa. "Elijah can't stop talking about the grandma lady. Is everything okay? Should we still come for dinner Saturday?" Harrison stared at the text without responding. Elijah Foster wasn't related to him by blood. He was the son of his goddaughter, Rebecca, who had died in a car accident 2 years earlier. Harrison had stepped in as a surrogate grandfather figure, maintaining a relationship with Rebecca's widower, James, and young Elijah. It was the closest thing to family he had allowed himself since Catherine. And now, this complication. 40 minutes later, Margaret emerged, transformed. Clean, and wearing a simple gray dress borrowed from Nina, she looked less like a street person and more like the professor she had once been. Her silver hair, washed and combed, framed a face that time and hardship had etched with deep lines. "I won't stay long," she said, before Harrison could speak. "I appreciate the shower and clean clothes, but we both know this isn't going to work." Harrison gestured to a chair. "Sit, please." "Eats," she complied, her posture still carrying traces of the dignity that had once characterized her. Back when she was Dr. Marion Wilson, respected English professor at Reed College, before everything fell apart. "How did you end up on the street?" Harrison asked bluntly. Margaret's hands folded in her lap. The usual story: medical bills, bad investments, predatory lending. "I lost my house 3 years ago. You should have reached out." A bitter laugh escaped her. "To you? The man who told me at Catherine's funeral that if I ever contacted him or Emily again, he would destroy what remained of my reputation? The man who called me a murderer?" Harrison flinched. "I was grieving. We all were," she replied quietly. "She was my daughter. A daughter you betrayed." The words hung between them, heavy with 2 decades of unresolved pain. Before Margaret could respond, the elevator to the penthouse chimed, and a young woman in her mid-20s stepped into the apartment. She wore medical scrubs and carried a backpack, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Dad? Nina said you brought someone." She froze as her eyes landed on Margaret. "Emily," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking on the name. Emily Pierce stared at the elderly woman, her expression a complex mix of shock, confusion, and something deeper. Something that looked almost like recognition, despite the fact that she had been only 5 years old when she last saw her grandmother. "What is she doing here?" Emily asked Harrison, her voice tight. "Emily, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" "Why the woman you always said was responsible for Mom's death is sitting in our living room?" Emily's voice rose, color flooding her cheeks. "The woman you specifically told me never to contact?" Margaret rose shakily to her feet. "I should go." "No." Harrison's voice was firm. "Both of you, sit down. This has gone on long enough." Emily crossed her arms. "I have a shift at the hospital in an hour. Call in. Tell them there's a family emergency." When Emily hesitated, Harrison added more softly, "Please, Em, it's time you knew the truth." "The truth?" Emily echoed. "So there's more to the story than your grandmother was driving drunk and killed your mother? Because that's what you've been telling me my entire life." Margaret winced, the accusation striking like a physical blow. "I wasn't drunk," she said quietly. "I've never had a drink in my life." Emily turned to her, eyes narrowing. "Then why did the police report say you were?" Harrison cleared his throat. "Because that's what I told them to say." The silence that followed Harrison's admission was absolute. Emily stared at her father, her medical training evident in the clinical way she observed him, checking for signs of dementia or confusion that might explain such an outlandish statement. "What are you talking about?" she finally asked. "You falsified a police report?" Harrison moved to the window, looking out over the city as if seeking distance from his own words. "I didn't falsify it personally. I had it changed." "That's impossible," Emily said. "You couldn't just—" "In 2003, with enough money and influence in Portland?" "Yes, I could." He turned to face them. "And I did." Margaret's hands trembled in her lap. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why destroy my life with a lie?" Harrison's jaw tightened. "Because the truth was worse." Emily sank onto the couch, her professional composure cracking. At 25, she was now older than her mother had been when she died. The irony wasn't lost on her, becoming a doctor, as if healing others might somehow retroactively save the mother she barely remembered. "Dad, start making sense," she demanded. "What really happened the night Mom died?" Harrison looked at Margaret, a silent communication passing between them. The shared understanding that once this door was opened, it could never be closed again. "Your mother was severely depressed after you were born," Harrison began. "Postpartum depression that evolved into something deeper. We kept it private. I was building the company then, establishing our reputation. Mental illness wasn't something people discussed openly, especially in our circles." Emily's medical mind cataloged this information, fitting it into the puzzle of her family's past. "So Mom was ill. What does that have to do with the accident?" Margaret spoke, her voice steadier now. "Catherine asked me to take her for a drive that night. She said she needed to get out of the house, clear her head. You were with a sitter. You always stayed with a sitter on Tuesday evenings because I taught a night class at Reed." Her eyes grew distant with memory. "She seemed better than she had in weeks. I thought she was improving." Harrison's hands clenched at his sides. "Tell her the rest, Marion." Margaret closed her eyes. "We were on Germantown Road, that winding stretch near the forest. Catherine was talking about how beautiful the stars were. Then suddenly, she grabbed the wheel. She jerked it hard toward the embankment. I couldn't stop her." Emily's face drained of color. "She caused the crash? Intentionally?" Yes, Harrison said flatly. Your mother committed suicide and nearly took your grandmother with her. The clinical term hung in the air, stripping away the protective fiction Emily had lived with her entire life. The official story was that Marion had been drinking and lost control of the vehicle. Harrison continued. It protected Catherine's memory, protected you from knowing your mother had chosen to leave you, and it gave me someone to blame. He looked at Margaret, something like remorse flickering across his features. Someone besides myself. You blame yourself? Emily asked softly. I knew how ill she was. I was so focused on the business, on our image. Harrison's voice trailed off. I didn't get her the help she needed. I thought we could handle it privately. Margaret's voice was gentle when she spoke again. We all missed signs, Harrison. Catherine was very good at hiding her darkest moments. Emily stood abruptly and walked to the mantel where a single photograph of her mother stood. Catherine Pierce, at 23. Radiant in her wedding dress, no hint of the darkness that would eventually consume her. So you let me believe my grandmother was a murderer? Emily's voice was dangerously quiet. You kept me from her, let her become homeless, while maintaining this lie? I didn't know she was homeless, Harrison protested weakly. Would it have mattered if you did? The question hung unanswered. When I woke up in the hospital after the crash, Margaret said softly, Harrison was there. He told me what the official story would be, that Catherine had been driving, but I was drunk behind the wheel. That's why you never fought it, Emily realized. You accepted the blame to protect Mom's memory. She was my daughter, Margaret said simply. What kind of mother would I be if I let the world remember her only for her darkest moment? Emily's professional calm finally shattered completely. What kind of father lets his child believe a lie for 20 years? What kind of man destroys an innocent woman's life to protect his own guilt? Emily, Harrison began. My entire life has been built around a foundation of lies, she cut him off. Do you have any idea what that feels like? Before either Harrison or Margaret could respond, Emily's phone chimed with a text. She glanced at it, her expression changing instantly. It's the hospital. Trauma coming in. Multiple casualties from a building collapse downtown. I have to go. She grabbed her backpack, pausing only briefly at the door. I expect both of you to be here when I get back. We're not done with this conversation. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Harrison and Margaret were left in uncomfortable silence. 20 years of blame and secrets finally exposed to the light. She has Catherine's fire, Margaret observed quietly. And your stubbornness, Harrison replied, a ghost of something almost like respect in his voice. What happens now, Harrison? He shook his head slowly. I don't know, but after 20 years, I think we owe it to Emily to figure it out. Seated as they sat in silence, the antique clock on the mantel ticked away, marking the beginning of a reckoning long overdue. The emergency room at Portland Memorial was chaos incarnate when Emily arrived. 6 construction workers had been injured when a scaffold collapsed at a downtown renovation project. Emily moved through the trauma bay with practiced efficiency, her personal turmoil temporarily set aside as she focused on saving lives. 4 hours later, with all patients stabilized, she found herself in the break room, staring unseeing at the vending machine. The revelation about her mother's death kept intruding into her thoughts, fragmenting her carefully constructed understanding of her own history. Pierce, you all right? Dr. Kamal, the trauma attending, studied her with concern. You seem distracted. Family stuff, she replied vaguely. Go home, he advised. Morrison's coming on shift, and we're past the critical stage with the construction injuries. Emily nodded gratefully and made her way to the locker room. As she changed out of her scrubs, her phone chimed with a text from her father. We're still here. Take your time." Something about the "we" in that message, the acknowledgement of Margaret as a person rather than just that woman, gave Emily pause. For 20 years, her father had maintained absolute silence about her grandmother, except to reinforce that she was dangerous, untrustworthy, responsible for the tragedy that had shaped their lives. What else had he lied about? When Emily returned to the penthouse, she found her father and grandmother sitting in silence at opposite ends of the living room. The tension between them was palpable, but something had shifted. The active hostility had been replaced by a wary, exhausted truce. "Have you eaten?" Harrison asked as Emily entered. She shook her head. "Too busy." Nina left dinner in the warming drawer before she left. "I'll get it." As Harrison disappeared into the kitchen, Emily took the opportunity to study her grandmother more carefully. Without the barrier of homelessness obscuring her features, Margaret Wilson's resemblance to the vague memories Emily had of her was stronger. The same high cheekbones, the same direct gaze that seemed to see past surface appearances. "He kept that silver frame all these years," Margaret said quietly, breaking the silence. "I never would have expected that." Emily's curiosity piqued. "The one with you reading to Mom under a tree?" Margaret nodded. "Catherine was about 10 in that picture. We were at Laurelhurst Park on a Sunday afternoon. Your grandfather, my husband, Edward, took it before his first diagnosis." "Diagnosis of what?" "Pancreatic cancer. He fought it for 3 years before he died. Catherine was 13 when we lost him." Emily absorbed this information, another piece of family history that had been kept from her. "I never knew my grandfather's name until now." Margaret's eyes registered surprise. "Harrison never told you about Edward?" Dad rarely spoke about Mom's life before they met. It was as if she didn't exist until she became Catherine Pierce. Emily hesitated, then asked, "What was she like? As a child?" A genuine smile softened Margaret's weathered face. "Brilliant, headstrong. She could read before kindergarten. She loved poetry, especially Emily Dickinson. That's who you're named after, you know." Emily hadn't known that either. The realization that fundamental facts about her own identity had been withheld from her stoked her anger anew. Harrison returned with a plate of food, catching the tail end of Margaret's comment. His face tightened. "Emily doesn't need to be confused with stories about a mother she can't remember." "Stories aren't confusion. They're connection," Margaret countered. "She deserves to know who her mother was, not just how she died." Emily accepted the plate but set it aside untouched. "I want to see it." "See what?" Harrison asked. "The silver frame, the photograph Elijah mentioned." Harrison's reluctance was visible, but after a moment, he nodded. "It's in my study." The three of them moved to Harrison's home office, a space Emily rarely entered. Unlike the impersonal elegance of the rest of the penthouse, this room contained actual evidence of a life lived. Books, papers, mementos carefully arranged on shelves and walls. Harrison unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a small silver frame. He handed it to Emily without comment. The photograph inside showed a much younger Margaret seated under a sprawling oak tree, a book open on her lap. Leaning against her was a girl with dark hair tumbling past her shoulders, head tilted back in laughter. They looked carefree, connected, alive with joy. "Mom looks happy," Emily said softly. "She was, that day," Margaret confirmed. "Most days, in fact, until her late teens. That's when the depression first appeared." Harrison's head snapped up. "What? Catherine was depressed before we met?" Margaret looked at him with genuine surprise. "Of course. She had her first major episode at 19, during her sophomore year at Portland State. She withdrew for a semester to recover. I thought you knew." "She never told me," Harrison said, his voice hollow. "We met when she was 21. She never mentioned any history of mental illness. She wouldn't have, Margaret replied gently. Catherine was terrified of being seen as broken or damaged. After what happened with her first fiancé. First fiancé? Emily interrupted. Mom was engaged before Dad? Margaret looked between them, realization dawning that she was revealing secrets Catherine had carefully kept buried. His name was Robert Lynch, she said after a pause. They were engaged briefly when Catherine was 20. When she told him about her depression and the medication she took, he broke things off, said he didn't want to risk having children with defective genes. Harrison sank into his desk chair, visibly shaken. She told me she had never been serious with anyone before me. She loved you, Harrison, Margaret said quietly. She probably feared losing you the way she lost Robert. Emily studied her father's face, seeing genuine shock there. Whatever lies he had told over the years, this revelation seemed to be as much a surprise to him as it was to her. So, Mom was mentally ill long before I was born, Emily said, processing this new information. It wasn't just postpartum depression. The pregnancy and your birth likely exacerbated an existing condition, Margaret agreed. But no, her struggles with depression began much earlier. Harrison stared at the photograph in Emily's hands. I built our entire life around protecting Catherine's memory, keeping her perfect in Emily's eyes. And now I find I didn't even really know her. None of us ever fully know another person, Margaret said softly. Not even those we love most. Emily placed the silver frame on the desk, a tangible link to a past she was only now beginning to understand. I think I've had enough revelations for one day, she said. It's late, and I have an early shift tomorrow. Will you come back tomorrow evening? Harrison asked, an unfamiliar note of uncertainty in his voice. Emily looked between her father and the grandmother she was just beginning to know. Yes, she said finally. I'll come back. We have a lot more to talk about. As she prepared to leave, a thought struck her. Where will you sleep tonight? She asked Margaret. I've prepared the guest room, Harrison answered before Margaret could speak. Unless you'd prefer a hotel? Margaret shook her head. The guest room will be fine for tonight. The "for tonight" hung in the air, an acknowledgement that this arrangement was temporary, that fundamental questions about Margaret's future remained unanswered. As Emily left, she found herself wondering how many other photographs, how many other pieces of her history remained locked in drawers and sealed in boxes, and whether the truth they contained would bring healing or only more pain. Morning light filtered through the guest room blinds, waking Margaret from the deepest sleep she'd had in years. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't place where she was. The softness of the mattress, the clean scent of the linens were so far removed from the shelter cots and makeshift bedding she'd grown accustomed to. Reality returned gradually. Harrison's penthouse. The confrontation. Emily's shocked face as 20 years of carefully constructed family mythology collapsed around her. Margaret rose slowly, her arthritic joints protesting. On the chair beside the bed lay clothes she didn't recognize, new items with price tags still attached. A note in handwriting she didn't recognize read, "Mr. Pierce had these delivered this morning. Breakfast is ready whenever you are. Nina." 20 minutes later, dressed in new clothes that fit surprisingly well, Margaret made her way to the kitchen. Harrison sat at the island counter, scanning something on a tablet, a half-eaten piece of toast beside him. "Good morning," she said cautiously. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Nina went a bit overboard with breakfast," he said by way of greeting, gesturing to the spread on the counter. "Fresh fruit, yogurt, pastries. Help yourself." Margaret selected a plain croissant and poured herself a cup of tea. They ate in awkward silence until Harrison finally spoke. "I've made an appointment for you at Portland Community Health Center this afternoon. Margaret's defenses immediately rose. "I don't need your charity, Harrison." "It's not charity. It's common sense," he replied evenly. "You've been living on the streets. You need a full medical evaluation." She couldn't argue with the logic, but the loss of agency, having decisions made for her after struggling so long to maintain independence in the most desperate circumstances, rankled. "And after the doctor?" she asked. "What's your plan for me, Harrison?" He set down his tablet and looked at her directly. "That depends on you." "What do you want, Marion?" The question caught her off guard. What did she want? For so long, her existence had narrowed to the most basic survival needs: food, shelter, safety. The luxury of wanting anything beyond that had been set aside. "I want," she began, then stopped, reconsidering. "I want to know my granddaughter. I want some measure of dignity restored. I don't want to be a burden or an obligation." Harrison nodded slowly. "Fair enough. There's a senior living community in the Pearl District, independent apartments with medical support available as needed. I own the building." He held up a hand as she began to protest. "Before you object, consider it repayment of a debt, not charity. I stole 20 years from you, Marion. I can't give that back, but I can ensure you don't spend what years remain in doorways and shelters." Margaret stared into her tea, weighing pride against practicality. At 73, with her health compromised by years of inadequate care and harsh living conditions, her options were limited. "I could teach again," she said, more to herself than to Harrison. "Not at a university, of course, but perhaps community literacy programs, English as a second language. I still have something to contribute." A fleeting expression that might almost have been admiration crossed Harrison's face. "I'm sure you do." Their fragile accord was interrupted by the chime of the elevator. Instead of Emily, however, it was Vanessa and young Elijah who stepped into the apartment. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," Vanessa said, looking embarrassed. "Elijah has been insistent since yesterday. He wouldn't go to school until he made sure the grandma lady was okay." Elijah approached Margaret directly, his earnest face serious. "Did you get enough to eat? Are you still cold?" The simple, compassionate questions from this child who owed her nothing brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "Yes to the first, no to the second," she answered honestly. "Thank you for asking, young man." Vanessa looked uncertainly between Harrison and Margaret. "We can come back another time if this isn't convenient." Harrison seemed about to agree when Margaret spoke up. "Actually, I was just telling Harrison that I used to be a teacher. Perhaps Elijah would like to see some of the children's books in the guest room." Nina kindly provided several, though I suspect they're meant more for decoration than reading. Elijah looked to Vanessa for permission. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "Just for a few minutes. We don't want to impose." As Margaret led Elijah toward the guest suite, Harrison gestured for Vanessa to join him in the kitchen. "I'm sorry for the intrusion," she said quietly. But he was absolutely adamant. He said he had a dream about her last night, that she was his other grandmother, and she needed help. Harrison's brow furrowed. "Children have active imaginations." "It's more than that," Vanessa insisted. "The way he responded to her yesterday? It was as if he recognized her somehow. James and I have been talking. There's something we never told you about Elijah's background." Harrison's attention sharpened. "What about it?" "When Rebecca and James adopted him as an infant, they were told very little about his birth mother, just that she was a college student who couldn't keep him. But there was a letter to be given to him when he turned 18. Vanessa hesitated, then continued. "Last year, after Rebecca died, James found it when he was going through their important papers. He opened it, thinking it might contain medical information that could be relevant before Elijah reached adulthood." "And?" Harrison prompted when she paused. "The birth mother's name was Sophia Wilson. She was a graduate student in English literature. Harrison went very still. Wilson is a common name. Yes, but here's the strange part. She specifically wrote that she chose James and Rebecca because of their connection to you. She said her grandmother had once known you, and she felt it was right that her son should have some connection to her family's past, even if indirectly. Harrison's mind raced, calculating dates and possibilities. Catherine and Emily weren't his only connections to the Wilson family. Catherine had had a younger cousin, Margaret's niece's daughter, whom they'd lost track of after the accident and subsequent estrangement. "You think Elijah is related to Marion somehow?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "I don't know," Vanessa admitted. "But the coincidence is striking." In the guest room, Margaret sat beside Elijah on the edge of the bed. A large illustrated book opened between them. She read aloud in her melodious former professor's voice, bringing the story to life. "You read just like my mom used to," Elijah commented when she finished a chapter. "Before she went to heaven." "I'm sorry about your mother," Margaret said gently. "It's very hard to lose someone you love." Elijah nodded solemnly. "Dad says she's watching over me. Do you think your daughter watches over you too?" The innocent question pierced straight to Margaret's heart. "I hope so," she replied softly. "Every single day." Elijah studied her face with that peculiar intensity children sometimes possess. "I have a picture of my birth mom too. She had hair like yours, but not so white." Margaret's breath caught. "Your birth mother?" "I'm adopted," Elijah explained matter-of-factly. "My real mom was too young to keep me. Dad says she was very brave to make sure I had a good family." Before Margaret could respond, Vanessa appeared in the doorway. "Time to go, honey. We've imposed on Ms. Wilson enough for today." "Can we visit again?" Elijah asked, reluctantly closing the book. Vanessa glanced at Margaret. "If it's all right with Ms. Wilson and Mr. Pierce." "I would like that very much," Margaret said sincerely. As Vanessa led Elijah away, Harrison stood in the living room, watching their interaction with an unreadable expression. After they left, he turned to Margaret. "Did Elijah say anything unusual to you?" Margaret hesitated. "He mentioned he was adopted, that his birth mother had hair like mine, but not so white." Harrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Get ready for your doctor's appointment. We'll talk about this later." The senior living apartment was modest but elegant, a one-bedroom unit with large windows overlooking a small courtyard garden. Margaret stood in the center of the living room, still trying to process the rapid changes of the past 3 days. From homeless to housed, from outcast to reconnected, from invisible to seen. The doctor at Portland Community Health Center had been thorough and kind, prescribing medications for her hypertension, arthritis, and the respiratory issues she'd developed living on the streets. Harrison had paid for everything without comment, then brought her directly to this place. Her new home, apparently. "The refrigerator is stocked with basics," he explained, standing awkwardly by the door, as if uncertain of his welcome. "There's a communal dining room downstairs if you prefer company with meals. Transportation to medical appointments is provided. Your name is on the lease." "My name?" Margaret turned to him in surprise. "It's your place, Marion, not mine. You can stay or go as you choose." The gift of agency, after so long without it, was almost overwhelming. Margaret sank onto the small sofa, running her hand over the soft fabric. "Why are you doing this, Harrison?" "Really?" He remained by the door, maintaining physical distance even as the emotional barriers between them had begun to crack. "I told you. I owe you a debt." "It's more than that," she pressed. "Something's changed. Is it Elijah?" Harrison's composure slipped slightly. "I need to confirm something first. I've arranged for a DNA test." "A DNA test? Why?" "Vanessa told me something yesterday. About Elijah's birth mother." He hesitated, then continued. Her name was Sophia Wilson. She was a graduate student in English literature. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Sophia? My grandniece? Catherine's cousin, yes. You remember she came to stay with you one summer when she was a teenager? Of course I remember, Margaret replied, her mind racing. After her parents' divorce, she lived with us for 3 months. Catherine adored her. They were more like sisters than cousins, despite the age difference. After Catherine's death and our estrangement, I lost track of Sophia. According to what Vanessa told me, Sophia specifically chose James and Rebecca as adoptive parents because of their connection to me. Margaret's eyes widened as understanding dawned. She wanted her son to be near family, even if indirectly. If it's true, if Elijah is Sophia's biological son, then he's my great-grandnephew, Margaret finished. Catherine's second cousin once removed. And connected to Emily as well, Harrison added. Not close blood relatives, but family nonetheless. Margaret sat with this revelation, emotions washing over her in waves. Where is Sophia now? Harrison's expression grew somber. I don't know. Vanessa said the adoption was closed except for the letter to be given to Elijah at 18. James opened it early after Rebecca died, which is how they learned about the connection to our families. We need to find her, Margaret said firmly. One step at a time, Harrison counseled. First, let's confirm if Elijah is indeed related to you. Then we can search for Sophia. Margaret nodded reluctantly, recognizing the wisdom in his approach. And Emily? Does she know about any of this? Not yet. I wanted to be certain before bringing it up. She's had enough shocks lately. An uncomfortable silence fell between them, the mention of Emily bringing them back to the raw wounds reopened by recent revelations. She's scheduled to come by my place this evening, Harrison said finally. I think you should be there. Margaret looked around at her new apartment, a sanctuary she had only just entered after years of precarious existence. The thought of leaving it so soon, of facing more emotional turmoil, was daunting. I'll come, she agreed, nonetheless. Emily deserves answers from both of us. Later that evening, Emily arrived at the penthouse to find her father and grandmother already there. The initial shock of seeing Margaret had faded, replaced by a complicated mix of curiosity, lingering anger at her father, and an unfamiliar feeling of connection to this woman who shared her blood but had been a stranger most of her life. You look tired, Margaret observed as Emily dropped her bag on a chair. 36-hour shift, Emily explained. We had a multi-car pileup on I-5 last night. Harrison watched their interaction carefully. There's dinner if you're hungry. Emily shook her head. Just coffee, please. She turned to Margaret. Dad texted that you've moved into Westbrook Gardens. That was quick. Your father is nothing if not efficient, Margaret replied, with a slight smile. When he decides on a course of action, he doesn't waste time. One of my better qualities, Harrison remarked dryly as he prepared Emily's coffee. Emily studied her grandmother more carefully in the soft evening light. Without the distraction of shock, and without the physical evidence of homelessness, she could see more clearly the resemblance between Margaret and old photographs of her mother. The same elegant bone structure, the same direct gaze. I have something to show you, Emily said suddenly, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a small wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl. I found this in my storage unit last night. I couldn't sleep after everything that happened, so I went digging through some of Mom's things that Dad gave me when I turned 18. She placed the box on the coffee table. Harrison stared at it as if it might contain something dangerous. Catherine's jewelry box, he said quietly. I haven't seen that in years. Emily opened it carefully. Inside, nestled among a few pieces of jewelry, was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "This was hidden in a secret compartment in the bottom," she explained, unfolding it with gentle fingers. "It's a letter. To me. From Mom." Margaret gasped softly. Harrison took an involuntary step forward, then stopped himself. "May I ask when it's dated?" Margaret inquired carefully. "3 days before she died," Emily replied, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. "She must have known, must have been planning." "Emily, you don't have to share this with us if you don't want to," Harrison said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "Actually, I think I do," Emily countered, "because it mentions both of you." She took a deep breath and began to read. "My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer with you, and for that, I am so deeply sorry. There are no words to adequately explain the darkness that has claimed me. No way to make you understand that this isn't your fault. You are the brightest light in my life, my perfect girl, and leaving you is the most unforgivable act I will ever commit." Emily paused, gathering herself before continuing. "Your father will blame himself. He shouldn't. Harrison has tried everything to help me, but some battles can't be won, even with all his resources and determination. Please don't let him carry that guilt." Harrison turned away, moving to the window, his back to the room as Emily read on. "And my mother, your grandmother Margaret, she has been my rock throughout my life, even when I pushed her away. If there's a way, please know her. Let her tell you about the parts of me that existed before the darkness came." Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, tears flowing freely now. "The hardest part of leaving is knowing I won't see you grow up. I won't see the incredible woman you'll become. But I have to believe that without the shadow of my illness hanging over our family, you and your father might find a clearer path forward. I love you more than my own life, which is why I'm setting you free from having to watch mine end slowly in some institution, piece by piece, as this disease consumes what remains of who I once was." Emily folded the letter carefully, returning it to the box. "There's more, but it's personal. The point is, she knew what she was doing. She planned it, and she didn't want either of you blaming yourselves." Harrison remained at the window, his shoulders rigid. "She never told me how bad it had gotten. I knew she was struggling, but I thought the new medication was helping. She hid things from all of us," Margaret said softly. "Even from me." Emily looked between her father and grandmother. These two people who had both loved her mother, who had spent 20 years locked in a bitter estrangement, fueled by grief and guilt. "Mom wanted us to be a family," she said finally. "Not divided by blame, not living in the shadow of how she died, but remembering how she lived." She turned to Harrison. "Dad, you need to tell me about Elijah, about the DNA test, about why you've been acting so strange since yesterday." Harrison turned, surprise evident on his face. "How did you know about that?" "Nina texted me. She's worried about you." Harrison sighed. "Your housekeeper has boundary issues." "She cares about you," Emily corrected. "Now tell me what's going on." Harrison glanced at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. Together, they explained about Sophia Wilson, about the possibility that Elijah might be connected to their family. Emily listened in stunned silence. "So, if the test confirms it, Elijah is what? My second cousin once removed? And you just discovered this by random chance? Because Grandma happened to be begging outside your building?" "The universe works in mysterious ways," Margaret murmured. "Or not so mysterious," Emily countered. "Sophia chose James and Rebecca as adoptive parents because of their connection to you, Dad. She wanted her son near family. Then Rebecca dies. James brings Elijah around you more often, and eventually he encounters his biological great-grandaunt, By complete chance? She shook her head in disbelief. That's not coincidence. That's fate. I don't believe in fate, Harrison said stiffly. Maybe you should start, Emily replied. Because what are the odds? Before Harrison could respond, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and immediately answered. James, yes, she's here. Both of them are. He listened for a moment. I see. Yes, I think that would be best. We'll see you then. He hung up and turned to them. The preliminary DNA results are in. Elijah is indeed Margaret's great-grandnephew. James is bringing him over tomorrow. He thinks it's time we all had a proper conversation. The anticipation of meeting Elijah in this new context, not as a stranger on the street, but as a newly discovered family member, had Margaret awake before dawn. She had returned to her new apartment the previous night, insisting she needed time alone to process everything, but sleep had proved elusive. Instead, she had spent hours going through the small bag of possessions she'd managed to keep during her time on the streets. A few photographs protected in plastic, Catherine's college graduation tassel, a smooth river stone Edward had given her on their last anniversary before his diagnosis, touchstones of a life that had once seemed irretrievably lost. Now, as she prepared to return to Harrison's penthouse for the meeting with James and Elijah, she found herself wondering about Sophia. The last time she had seen her grandniece, Sophia had been a rebellious teenager spending the summer with them while her parents sorted out their contentious divorce. Catherine, already married to Harrison and pregnant with Emily, had taken the girl under her wing, forming a bond that transcended their age difference. After Catherine's death and the subsequent rupture with Harrison, Margaret had lost track of Sophia. Had she tried to find Margaret over the years? Had she known about her great-aunt's circumstances? The questions tumbled through her mind as the car Harrison had sent delivered her back to the penthouse. Emily was already there when she arrived, helping Nina arrange coffee and refreshments. The young doctor offered Margaret a tentative smile, not quite warm, but no longer guarded with suspicion. "How was your first night in the new place?" Emily asked. "Strange," Margaret admitted. "After so long without walls around me, it felt almost confining at first. But I slept in a real bed, used a private bathroom. Simple luxuries I'd forgotten." A shadow crossed Emily's face. Regret, perhaps, for what her grandmother had endured while she had lived in comfort, believing her to be the villain in their family tragedy. Harrison emerged from his study, impeccably dressed as always, though Margaret noticed the slight shadow under his eyes that suggested he too had slept poorly. "James and Elijah will be here at 11, he announced. James suggested we not overwhelm Elijah with too much information at once. "He knows you're Catherine's mother," he nodded to Margaret, "and that makes you his extended family in some way. The specifics of how he's biologically related to us can wait until he's older." "I agree," Margaret said. 8 is too young to understand the complexities of family trees and DNA. It's enough that he knows we're connected." The elevator chimed, announcing their visitor's arrival. Elijah entered first, his face lighting up when he saw Margaret. "Grandma lady!" he exclaimed, then immediately looked embarrassed. "I mean, Ms. Wilson." "You can call me Margaret," she offered gently. James Foster followed his son, a tall man with kind eyes and the weary expression of a single father doing his best. "Thank you for having us," he said, shaking hands with Harrison. "This has been unexpected, to say the least." "For all of us," Harrison agreed. They settled in the living room, Elijah gravitating naturally to the spot beside Margaret on the sofa. The adults maintained a careful conversation, steering around the most complicated aspects of their situation, while Elijah listened with obvious curiosity. "So you're my mom's cousin's mom?" he asked Margaret, trying to work out the connection. Margaret smiled. "Something like that." Family relationships can be complicated. But we are family, he persisted. I knew it when I saw you. That's why I called you Grandma. The simple conviction in his voice touched something deep in Margaret's heart. Yes, Elijah, we are family. James cleared his throat. Actually, there's something else I wanted to discuss with all of you. He reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. This came yesterday. I almost didn't open it, but after everything that's happened, he handed it to Harrison. It's from Sophia. The return address is Stanford University. Harrison stared at the envelope. She's at Stanford? Apparently. It's the first contact we've had since the adoption was finalized 8 years ago. Emily leaned forward. What does she say? James glanced at Elijah, who was now showing Margaret a game on his tablet, distracted from the adult conversation. She's been following my career through academic publications. When Rebecca and I published our book on pediatric trauma recovery 2 years ago, she recognized my name. She's been working up the courage to reach out ever since. Does she want to meet Elijah? Harrison asked directly. She'd like to, yes. She's a professor now, English literature at Stanford. She's married, has 2 other children. James ran a hand through his hair. She included her phone number, said the timing and circumstances would be entirely up to me. Margaret's heart raced at the news. Sophia was successful, stable, a professor like herself. And nearby, relatively speaking, Stanford was only a day's drive or a short flight away. We should tell her about Margaret, Emily said, voicing what they were all thinking. About how we found each other again. James nodded. I thought the same thing. It's why I brought the letter today. He looked at Margaret. She mentions you, actually. Says she tried to find you years ago but hit dead ends. She assumed you'd retired and moved away from Portland. The pain of those lost years, of opportunities for connection missed because of stubbornness, pride, and false narratives, sat heavily in the room. Harrison broke the silence. I'd like to call her. With your permission, James. James considered for a moment, then nodded. I think that would be appropriate, but not today. Let's give Elijah time to process meeting his extended family first. As the adults talked, formulating plans and beginning to heal the fractures that had kept them apart for so long, Elijah looked up from his game and studied them with a child's perceptive gaze. Are you sad, Margaret? He asked suddenly. Startled, she looked down at him. What makes you ask that, dear? Your eyes look happy, but sad at the same time. Like Dad's did after Mom went to heaven. Out of the mouths of babes. Margaret gently touched his hair. I am a little sad about things that happened in the past, but I'm also very happy to have found you and to be getting to know Emily again. Elijah nodded sagely. Dad says it's okay to feel 2 things at once, even if they seem like opposites. Your dad is very wise, Margaret told him, glancing at James with new appreciation for the man who had raised this thoughtful child. As the visit continued, Margaret found herself watching the interactions between Harrison and James, between Emily and Elijah, between past and present. The tangled threads of their lives, once violently severed, were being carefully rewoven into a new pattern, one that acknowledged the tears and breaks, but incorporated them into something that might, with time and care, become whole again. Later, as James prepared to leave with Elijah, the boy hugged Margaret tightly. Can I visit you at your new house? Of course, she replied, blinking back tears. I would like that very much. And can we read more books? As many as you'd like. After they left, the 3 remaining family members sat in contemplative silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts about the day's events. I never imagined this, Harrison finally said. Any of it. Life rarely follows the paths we imagine for it, Margaret observed. Emily stood, gathering her things. I need to get back to the hospital. But I'll come by your place tomorrow, Grandma. If that's all right? The word grandma, spoken for the first time without irony or anger, hung in the air between them. Margaret could only nod, too moved to speak. After Emily left, Harrison walked Margaret to the elevator. "I'll have the car take you home," he said. Then, more hesitantly, "Would you like to be there when I call Sophia?" Margaret considered the question. "Yes," she said simply. "I would." As the elevator doors closed between them, Margaret reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. From academic to homeless woman to rediscovered family matriarch in the span of a single week. She thought of Catherine's letter, released from its hiding place after 20 years, with its plea not to let Harrison carry his guilt alone. Perhaps, in their own imperfect way, they were finally honoring Catherine's last wish, not by forgetting the tragedy of her death, but by rebuilding what that death had shattered, creating space for new connections and healing to emerge from the wreckage of the past. 3 months passed, bringing changes both subtle and profound. Margaret's health improved steadily with proper medication and nutrition. The persistent cough that had plagued her during her time on the streets faded. And though her arthritis would always be a challenge, regular physical therapy sessions had increased her mobility significantly. Her apartment at Westbrook Gardens had transformed from a sterile space into a true home. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes donated by Emily, purchased by Harrison, or found by Margaret herself during weekly trips to Powell's Books with Elijah. Small potted plants brought life to the windowsills, and photographs, new and old, clustered on side tables and walls, visual testimony to a family reconstituting itself. Emily visited regularly, sometimes bringing lunch after her hospital shifts, sometimes just stopping by for tea. Their relationship was evolving gradually, building from scratch rather than trying to recapture what might have been. Harrison was more reserved in his visits, but he came nonetheless, weekly at first, then more frequently as autumn gave way to winter. He and Margaret had developed an unlikely friendship built on shared memories of Catherine and a mutual commitment to building relationships with Emily and Elijah. And today, a new milestone approached. Sophia Wilson Chen was coming to Portland. Margaret stood in her living room, adjusting and readjusting a vase of fresh flowers. The nervousness she felt at meeting her grandniece after so many years was matched only by her excitement. They had spoken by phone several times since Harrison's initial call, each conversation peeling back layers of lost time. Sophia had wept when she learned of Margaret's experiences, the homelessness, the estrangement from Emily. "I should have tried harder to find you," she'd said. "When the letters started coming back marked return to sender, I thought you'd moved away, changed your contact information deliberately. You couldn't have known," Margaret had assured her, "and you had your own life to build." Now Sophia was coming with her husband David and their 2 children, 5-year-old twins, a boy and a girl. They would meet Elijah for the first time, though James had shared photos and videos to prepare him for the encounter with his biological mother. The knock at Margaret's door came precisely at the arranged time. She opened it to find Harrison, Emily, James, and Elijah waiting in the hallway. "We thought we'd come together," Emily explained. "Strength in numbers." "Are you nervous?" Elijah asked Margaret, with his characteristic directness. "Dad says it's okay to be nervous when you're meeting someone important, even if you already know them." Margaret smiled, her anxiety easing slightly at the boy's perceptiveness. "A little nervous, yes, but mostly happy." They had just settled in the small living room when a text arrived from Sophia. They were in the lobby. Harrison went down to escort them up, leaving the others in a state of anticipatory silence. When the door opened again, Margaret's breath caught. The woman who entered was in her mid-30s, with dark hair and eyes that instantly reminded Margaret of Catherine. Behind her came a slender Asian-American man and two small children who clung to their parents' hands, eyes wide with curiosity. "Aunt Margaret," Sophia said, her voice breaking slightly as she crossed the room. They embraced, years of separation, dissolving in the simple human contact. "Look at you," Margaret said, holding her at arm's length. "All grown up, and a professor, just like your old great-aunt." "I followed in your footsteps," Sophia acknowledged, with a smile. "You were always my example of what a woman could achieve academically." Introductions flowed around them, David shaking hands with Harrison and James, the twins being coaxed forward to meet everyone, Elijah watching Sophia with undisguised fascination. "You have Mom's eyes," he said suddenly during a lull in conversation. "I've seen pictures." Sophia knelt to his level, clearly emotional but maintaining composure. "Yes, people have always said I look like the Wilson side of the family." "Is that why you picked my dad to adopt me? Because he knew Mr. Pierce, and Mr. Pierce knew the Wilsons?" The adults exchanged glances, impressed by Elijah's grasp of the situation. James had prepared him well, it seemed. "That was part of it," Sophia admitted. "But mostly I chose your dad and mom because they were kind, smart people who wanted very much to love a child. I was right, wasn't I?" Elijah nodded seriously. "Dad's the best, and Mom was too, before she went to heaven." Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "I was so sorry to hear about Rebecca. She sent me photos of you every year on your birthday, just as we'd arranged." The conversation flowed more easily after that, the initial awkwardness giving way to genuine connection. The children gravitated toward Elijah's tablet, where he showed the twins his favorite games. The adults shared stories, filling in gaps in their shared history, finding points of connection across the years of separation. "I tried to find you after I graduated college," Sophia told Margaret, "but by then, you'd lost your house, and no one seemed to know where you'd gone." "I was too proud to reach out for help," Margaret admitted. "After losing everything, I couldn't bear the thought of being a burden to family." "Pride runs in the Wilson blood," Harrison commented dryly. "Catherine had it too." "Speaking of Catherine," Sophia said, reaching into her bag, "I've brought something I thought you might want to see." "Tree?" She withdrew a small photo album and handed it to Margaret. "These are from that summer I stayed with you, the summer before Emily was born." Margaret opened the album with trembling hands. There, preserved in plastic sleeves, were moments she had thought lost forever. Catherine laughing in the garden of their old house, her pregnancy just beginning to show. Edward pretending to scowl over his newspaper as teenage Sophia painted her nails at the kitchen table. Margaret herself, 20 years younger, hair still more brown than gray, reading in the window seat that had been her favorite spot. "I kept these all these years," Sophia explained. "They were my connection to that time in my life when I felt most secure, most part of a real family. My parents' divorce was difficult. Those 3 months with you and Uncle Edward, with Catherine and Harrison, they gave me a model of what family could be." "Catherine adored you," Harrison said quietly. "She was so excited to have a little sister around that summer." As the album made its way around the room, Emily lingering longest over the images of the mother she barely remembered, Margaret observed the scene with a sense of wonder. Here they all were, 4 generations of a family that had been torn apart by tragedy, secrets, and pride, finding their way back to each other through the most unlikely of circumstances. A child's random act of kindness toward a homeless woman. A word, "Grandma," spoken instinctively by a boy who somehow recognized his own. A silver-framed photograph kept in a locked drawer for 20 years. "I want to propose something," Harrison said as the afternoon progressed. A family dinner. At my place. Once a month to start. More often if schedules permit. The suggestion, simple on its surface, represented something profound. Harrison Pierce, who had spent 2 decades maintaining emotional isolation as a defense against further pain, voluntarily opening his home and heart to the expanding circle of family. "I think that's a wonderful idea," Margaret said, meeting his eyes across the room. Catherine would approve. Later, as the gathering began to wind down, Margaret found herself alone with Sophia for a moment in the small kitchen. "Thank you," Sophia said quietly. "For what, dear?" "For being found." Sophia squeezed her hand. "When Elijah was born, giving him up was the hardest thing I've ever done. But I was 22, single, still in graduate school. I couldn't give him what he deserved." "You gave him a wonderful family," Margaret assured her. "Yes, but I always worried that I'd deprived him of knowing his heritage, his roots. I chose James and Rebecca partly because of their connection to Harrison, hoping somehow that would keep Elijah in the orbit of his blood family." Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "I never imagined it would work out quite like this." "The universe has strange ways of bringing people together," Margaret said, echoing what she had told Emily months before. "Or back together, as the case may be." As they rejoined the others, Margaret caught Harrison watching her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Something that might almost be called admiration. "What is it?" she asked quietly when they had a moment apart from the others. "I was just thinking," he replied, "about how much stronger you are than I ever gave you credit for. 20 years on your own, the last few in unimaginable conditions, yet here you are, rebuilding, connecting, moving forward." "We do what we must," she said simply. "One day at a time." Harrison nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Catherine saw that strength in you. She wrote about it in her journals I couldn't bring myself to read until recently. She admired you enormously, even when she was pushing you away. The acknowledgement of her strength, of her daughter's love despite the complexity of their relationship, was a gift Margaret had never expected to receive, certainly not from Harrison. "Thank you for telling me that," she said softly. As the day drew to a close and goodbyes were exchanged, promises made for future gatherings, Margaret found herself standing beside Elijah at the window, watching the winter sunset paint the Portland skyline in shades of gold and rose. "Are you still sad sometimes?" he asked, continuing their conversation from months before. Margaret considered the question carefully. "Yes," she answered honestly. "I still miss your great cousin Catherine very much. I still regret the years I didn't get to see Emily grow up. But the sadness doesn't feel as heavy now." Elijah nodded sagely. "Because you're not alone anymore. Out of the mouths of babes, indeed." "That's exactly right," Margaret agreed. "I'm not alone anymore. And as she looked around at the people filling her small apartment, at Emily laughing with Sophia's twins, at Harrison deep in conversation with David about Stanford's research programs, at James and Sophia sharing stories about Elijah's early childhood, Margaret felt a sense of completion she had thought forever, beyond her reach. The circle, so long broken, was whole again. Different, marked by the scars of what had been lost, but whole nonetheless. 1 year later. The private dining room at Clearwater, one of Portland's most exclusive restaurants, hummed with conversation and laughter. Crystal glasses caught the light from the elegant chandelier overhead, and the scent of exquisite food filled the air. Around the large round table sat an unlikely family gathering, unlikely not in their connection to one another, but in the miraculous path that had brought them together. Margaret Wilson, now 74, sat at the center, a silver pin bearing the Reed College insignia adorning the lapel of her tailored jacket. The past year had transformed her, not just physically as improved circumstances restored her health, but spiritually as well. The bitterness that had threatened to calcify around her heart during those years of isolation had melted away, replaced by a hard-won wisdom and capacity for joy that inspired everyone around her. "Attention, everyone," Harrison called, tapping his glass. "Before dessert arrives, I'd like to make an announcement." The conversations quieted as all eyes turned to him. In the years since Margaret had re-entered his life, Harrison too had changed. The rigid control and emotional distance that had characterized him for decades gradually giving way to a more nuanced approach to life and relationship. "Today marks 2 important anniversaries," he continued. 1 year since our first official family dinner, and more significantly, the 21st anniversary of Catherine's passing. A respectful silence fell at the mention of the woman whose absence had shaped all their lives in different ways. For 20 years, I believed the best way to honor Catherine's memory was to protect Emily from the truth, to maintain a narrative that preserved her mother's image, even at the cost of relationships that should have been cherished. Harrison's gaze moved to Margaret. "I was wrong." Emily reached across the table to squeeze her father's hand, while Margaret nodded slightly, acknowledging both his words and how far they had all come. "So today, I'm announcing the establishment of the Catherine Pierce Memorial Scholarship at Reed College," Harrison continued. "A full-ride scholarship for students showing promise in English literature and struggling with mental health challenges." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. "Harrison, that's wonderful." "There's more," he said. "The scholarship will be administered by the newly established Marion Wilson Distinguished Professorship in English Literature." A gasp escaped Margaret. "But I?" "Reed's president was quite receptive to the idea of bringing you back as a guest lecturer next semester," Harrison explained. "Apparently, you're still remembered quite fondly in the department." Emily beamed at her grandmother. "Surprise! Dad and I have been working on this for months." Elijah, now 9, and increasingly comfortable in his complex family dynamic, piped up from his seat beside James. "Does this mean Margaret's going to be a teacher again?" "It means," Sophia explained to her biological son, "that Margaret will be sharing her knowledge with college students again, just like she used to, and just like I do now, and just like I will someday," added Emily, "if I ever finish my MBA alongside my medical practice." The conversation flowed around them. Plans for Margaret's return to academia, updates on Sophia's latest publication, news of James's recent promotion at the Children's Hospital where he worked as a child psychologist. The twins argued good-naturedly about their upcoming piano recital, while Elijah described his science fair project to anyone who would listen. David, Sophia's husband, raised his glass. "I'd like to propose a toast of my own. To Margaret, who proves it's never too late for new beginnings." "To Margaret," echoed around the table, glasses clinking in celebration of the woman who had journeyed from desperate homelessness to renewed purpose in the span of a single year. As dessert arrived, Harrison drew Margaret aside, guiding her toward the restaurant's small balcony overlooking the Willamette River. The evening air was crisp but not uncomfortable, the city lights reflecting on the dark water below. "There's something else I wanted to tell you," he said when they were alone. "Something personal." Margaret studied his face, noting the unfamiliar vulnerability in his expression. "What is it?" "I've been seeing a therapist," he admitted, "since shortly after we found each other again. Working through my grief, my guilt, learning to forgive myself for not saving Catherine." "Oh, Harrison," Margaret's voice was soft with understanding. "None of us could have saved her. Not if she didn't want to be saved." "I know that now," he replied. "Intellectually, at least. The heart takes longer to accept such things. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, these two people who had once been adversaries, united by their love for the same woman. Catherine would be proud of Emily, Margaret observed. A doctor with her father's business acumen and her mother's compassion, and her grandmother's resilience, Harrison added. After a pause, he continued, I've been meaning to ask you something. That day on the street, when Elijah approached you, what were you thinking when he called you Grandma? Margaret smiled at the memory. I thought he was confused, of course, but there was something in his eyes, a recognition that seemed impossible, yet felt completely natural, as if the blood connection between us somehow transcended our never having met. Do you believe in such things? Harrison asked. Connections that defy rational explanation? I believe that love leaves traces, Margaret replied thoughtfully. In our DNA, in our instincts, in the way certain faces or voices resonate with us without apparent reason. She turned to face him directly. I believe Catherine's love for all of us created pathways that eventually led us back to each other, even if the journey took 20 years and a remarkable coincidence. Harrison nodded slowly. I've spent most of my life believing only in what I could control, what I could verify with facts and figures. This past year has challenged those limitations. Growth usually does, Margaret observed with a small smile. Inside the restaurant, they could see their family through the glass doors, Emily showing something on her phone to Sophia. The children engaged in what appeared to be an animated game involving dessert spoons, James and David in deep conversation. A tableau of connection that had seemed impossible just a year ago. Shall we rejoin them? Margaret suggested. In a moment, Harrison replied. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. I wanted to return this to you first. Margaret opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside lay a simple gold band with a small pearl. Her wedding ring, the one she had been forced to sell 3 years ago when facing eviction from her last apartment before the streets claimed her. How did you? I have resources, Harrison said simply. It took some doing, but the pawn shop had records, and the buyer was willing to sell it back for the right price. Tears filled Margaret's eyes as she slipped the ring onto her finger. A perfect fit, just as it had been when Edward placed it there 50 years ago. Thank you, she whispered, the words inadequate for the gesture's profound significance. Harrison nodded, understanding in his eyes. Edward should always be part of our family story, too. Without him, there would be no Catherine, no Emily, no connection to Sophia and Elijah. As they returned to the warmth and light of the dining room, rejoining the family that had formed from the broken pieces of their past, Margaret felt a sense of completion that had eluded her for decades. Not because all wounds were healed, some never would be completely, but because those wounds had been acknowledged, tended to with care rather than hidden away to fester. Later that evening, as the gathering began to disperse with promises of next month's dinner already being planned, Elijah approached Margaret with the directness that was so characteristic of him. I have a school assignment, he announced. We have to interview someone who has an interesting life story and write a report. Margaret smiled. And who will you interview? You, of course, he replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Miss Kelly says the best stories are about people who lost something important, but found something new. From the mouths of babes, indeed. I would be honored, Margaret told him seriously, though I should warn you, it's quite a long story. Elijah's face lit up with a smile that reminded her, with a bittersweet pang, of Catherine at the same age. That's okay. The best stories always are. But as she watched him return to James, Margaret reflected on the strange, winding path that had led her from academic success to abject poverty, to this moment of renewed purpose and connection. A year ago, she had been invisible, just another elderly homeless woman extending a paper cup to indifferent passers-by. Today, she stood at the center of a family restored, a legacy preserved, a future opening before her despite her advanced years. All because a small boy with kind eyes had seen her, truly seen her, when others looked away, had called her Grandma in a moment of inexplicable recognition that had stopped a millionaire in his tracks and set in motion a series of events that none of them could have anticipated. As she prepared to leave the restaurant, Emily approached with her coat. "I'll drive you home, Grandma," she offered, the term of endearment now natural and unforced. "Thank you, dear," Margaret replied, her heart full. Outside, the Portland sky had cleared, revealing a canopy of stars above the city lights. Margaret paused for a moment, looking upward, remembering Catherine's words from the letter. "Let her tell you about the parts of me that existed before the darkness came." She had done that, and would continue to do so, preserving Catherine's memory not as a tragic ending, but as an essential thread in the tapestry of their shared lives. The darkness that had claimed her daughter had not claimed them all. In fact, they had found their way back to light, back to each other, through the very act of confronting that darkness together. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret, that it had taken reaching her lowest point, begging on a street corner, to set in motion the healing that none of them had been able to achieve in 20 years of prosperity and achievement. As Emily drove her home through the familiar streets of a city that no longer represented fear and deprivation, but renewal and possibility, Margaret Wilson, professor, mother, grandmother, survivor, felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her, not just for the material comforts that had been restored to her, but for the far greater treasures of family reconnected, purpose rediscovered, and the knowledge that even the most broken paths could lead, eventually, to home. Life's most profound connections often emerge from our most vulnerable moments. Margaret's story reminds us that no matter how far we fall or how much we lose, the human capacity for resilience, forgiveness, and renewal remains. True family transcends estrangement, misunderstanding, and even time itself, sometimes finding us in the most unexpected ways, through the unfiltered perception of a child or the reluctant recognition of an old adversary. This narrative teaches us that it's never too late to heal old wounds, to rebuild what was broken, or to find new purpose. Every ending contains within it the seeds of a new beginning. If only we have the courage to nurture them and the wisdom to recognize them when they appear before us, sometimes in the form of a simple word. Grandma, did this story move you? Let us know in the comments. Which moment touched you the most? Rate it from 0 to 10 and tell us where you're watching from. Your feedback helps us create even deeper and more meaningful stories. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, and keep watching by clicking the suggestions on your screen. Thank you for being here with us.